Good evening, friends and foes, and welcome to the first episode of the No Hetero Bro podcast, where we read gay stories because, let's be honest, we need more. Tonight's story is called L'amour et l'amour, French for Love is Death. Now, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals, sit back, relax, and enjoy. The musician sat at the grand piano, his fingers drifting gently over the keys. The chipped ivory had yellowed over the long years, and his piano hadn't been touched by living fingers in far too long. They had forgotten to tune the old instrument and had swapped it for the piano on the other side of the stage, glossy and regularly used as an instrument should be. It saddened him to know that the actors had forgotten their history. The only people that tripped through the theater were high school students with dreams of Broadway and money. It had been far too long since someone had been a part of the show that was there for the essence of the theater and not for the glamour. Things had changed far too much for his liking. It was enough to make any well-mannered ghost go vengeful, but Vaude had assured him that there was purpose to his immortal existence, and that any day now he would see the reason for his resurrection. Mason was unsure if this were true, or if Vaude's mind had simply begun to fade with the passion of the actors. Besides his doubts, he knew it to be true that they were never wrong, at least not in the years he'd been dead, and he wasn't going to begin questioning them now when their prophecies were the only thing keeping him from going mad. Vaude stood in the balcony, looking down at Mason as he sat at the piano. There was excitement in the air surrounding them as the days counted down. No one but Vaude knew what for, but with enough prodding, the ghosts could usually get some sort of prophetical nonsense from them. Some convoluted message that usually meant the concession stand was out of Reese's Pieces peanut butter cups, their favorite candy, or that the volunteers had forgotten to put toilet paper in the bathrooms. But once in a while, they had something special to say. Today was one of those days. Unfortunately for the excited prophet, the one whom the message was meant for was moping over a dusty music box. Even further forcing their mouths shut, another party entered the auditorium. Vaude's form dissolved. Beth sauntered out from just beneath the balcony, her feathered skirt curling around her ankles as she came to stand still. Her crystal earrings swayed, reflecting unnatural sparkles in the dim, almost lightless room, and her heels silenced themselves on the carpet flooring. She admired the melancholy musician at his piano like a fox to a chicken. Envy cut her lip as she thought of the prophecy she had weaseled from Vaude. She had believed it preposterous and morally inappropriate. The dead were dead for a reason, and the living would never understand that. She knew Vaude nor Mason would ever understand that truly, but she would be damned to let the living take what was rightfully hers. Mason could smell hatred in the air. He looked over his shoulder to see the scowling white peacock-adjacent woman.
Evening, Beth, dear. Care to tone down the vengefulness? It smells quite putrid.
He watched her from the corner of his eye dust her skirt and gracefully flop her fan, covering the bottom of her face faux bashfully with it. She gently fluttered it in front of herself, the feathers accentuating the small movement tremendously as she spoke.
Pardon my actions, musician. Can't help an old ghost sometimes.
Mason sighed and turned back to the piano, closing the fall board gently before standing and pushing away the bench with the back of his knees. He turned to her with an outstretched elbow.
Care to walk?
He asked. Beth was more than happy to join arms with him and stroll about the theater. For what purpose he had in mind, she didn't think about, as she was simply excited for his attention. The two walked about the familiar halls and single file wound through the aisles. The theater was silent for the two, but pleasantly alive with memories, and when they stood in front of seat number 36A, they got blinks of Christmas Carol, and old burlesque acts in front of seat 22G, and so forth. There were endless old performances to watch. Nowadays, not many shows remained in the theater long, for the community's excitement had dimmed. Eventually, the two came to stand in front of seat 11B. Beth made a small startled noise that resembled a small bird being punched. Mason stood still, settled in the pathway before her. She cleared her throat and tapped his arm with her fan. He looked at her expectantly and cocked a brow. Very quickly, she realized her predicament and shoved his arm away from her.
Mason, move.
He sat down in seat 10B and put his feet up on the chair in front of him, blocking her pathway. She whacked his shin with her fan hard enough to hear a solid crack in the thin wooden slats of the fan.
I said move.
Mason just stared at her, a vengeful fire glimmering behind his dead white eyes.
Sit down.
She gulped and sat down beside him obediently. She shielded her eyes from the memories before her, but even with the fan raised before her porcelain skin, she could still feel the heat of the inferno.
Why do you treat me so?
She whispered tearfully.
What have I ever done to evoke such hatred?
Mason grabbed her wrist, pulling it down to remove her feather shield, the flames licking her skin.
Vaughn told me what you did, how you chased him away. If you must frighten away my love, you must be reminded of what you did to your own.
Mason smelt of rotten flesh and dirt. His nails that dug into Beth's pale wrist cracked and yellowed. His eyes glossed over like curdled milk, and thick congealed blood dripped from a bullet hole in his chest. Beth's painted face crackled under the fire, and tears that ran from her pale white eyes went up in steam. The two locked together in a vengeful spite, filling the air of the theater with a scent of rancid, burning flesh. Without warning, a loud crack split the atmosphere between them, and Vaud's voice echoed like 1,000 mumbling voices within their heads.
Now is not the time for your vengeance. The man has returned to seek your future, as all things should be. And yet, you lifeless fools linger on the past. He has begun his story. Now it is your turn to lead, for you are the directors.
And just as fast as they arrived, Vaud was gone. The two were left sat side by side with ringing headaches. The air had cleared of the disgusting smells and was instead left with a more pleasant, but not entirely enjoyable, stale, dusty smell forgotten theaters tend to have. Their spectral forms returned to ghostly pale figures dressed in their individual death-appropriate attire. Beth, her long white vintage feathered frock, a large plume held to the top of her bob by a silk-like band. Mason wore a sharp-looking black tailcoat and trousers, a white button-up beneath it, and was carefully cinched to the stomach by a well-fit and well-worn waistcoat. They both cleaned up quite nicely, especially under the pressure of a displeased prophet. Mason stood suddenly and walked a few steps away before dissipating, leaving Beth to stare into the flames that burned her. Mason sat on the balcony, tapping a roll of music sheets on his knee to the sound of the music filling the theater. The actors below him stood out of place. The stage itself was outfitted with a set that resembled the inside of a mansion that seemed subpar to the sets he'd seen in the past. Beth was below him, tipping the director's pages off his stand and causing her usual chaos. It wasn't any different than any other plays in the last few years, dull, underproduced, and all about what everyone wanted for themselves. All of a sudden, a loud crashing noise came from the direction of the lobby, followed by the sound of profuse apologies. There was excitement. The director turned towards the sound and excused himself, leaving everyone curious. Mason's eyes shot to Beth, who was still muddling with the director's things, before standing and rushing down the balcony to peer into the lobby. Stepping into the lobby, he felt what he could almost describe as a beating heart within his chest. Gathering handfuls of ticket stubs from the lobby floor was a flustered young man. His dark brown curly hair bounced around his ears as he hurried about, his glasses sitting at the edge of his nose dangerously close to sliding off. He pushed them back up with the second knuckle of his pointer finger before returning his hand to the pile of torn ticket ends. Mason felt himself yearning to step out into the light, to approach the man and ask his name, to play him songs on the piano and sing him love songs. But alas, he remembered himself, deceased and rotting, trapped within the walls of this building. But very abruptly, he wanted to be seen and heard by the living. The man stood, brushing away any grime from the floor off his hands, and joined the director who had come to help him.
Don't worry yourself too much, Eli. You're the only one who really gives a shit that you're late anyways.
The man, now presumed to be Eli, nodded and readjusted his glasses again.
Right, it's a shame. The theater's not the way it used to be.
The director patted him on the back and led him through Mason's transparent form and into the theater. Mason reached out as he passed and ran his hand down Eli's arm, watching as his arm became covered in goosebumps. A heartsick smile graced his lips as his own arm was suddenly yanked towards the stairs. Beth snarled as she dragged his resistant body up the stairs onto the balcony.
What the hell are you doing?
Mason looked past Beth down to the stage where Eli was just now climbing the 3 wooden steps that led to stage right.
I'm not doing anything worse than what you've done.
She scoffed.
Nothing worse than I've done. I was messing with inanimate objects. You touched the living.
Mason rolled his eyes and taunted her with puppeting his hand on a blah blah motion, quickly paying for his snarky attitude as Beth slapped him across the face. The sound echoed throughout the theater like the sound of snapping wood. "What was that?" a kid sitting on the edge of the stage asked with big curious eyes scanning the theater. Eli ruffled his hair playfully and picked him up by his armpits, putting him on his hip.
Didn't you know the theater is haunted? The ghost must want us to get on with the show. What do you think? Should we get on with it?
The kid nodded nervously, holding tighter to Eli at the mention of ghosts. On the balcony, Mason held Beth's wrist in his iron grip.
Look who's causing problems now.
The theater emptied slowly as kids were picked up by their exhausted parents. Eli remained behind the rest to admire the theater alone. It had been a long time since the last time he had been here. His last memory was 16 years ago. He was only 8 years old, dancing in the shows with his two best friends at the time. But after that show, life kicked in and it was time for him to grow up fast. As the years passed, he grew more and more desperate to return, to relax into the arms of the theater and leave his troubles on the front steps. He admired the auditorium from his center spot on the stage. He was alone now, with nothing but the memories of the past shows. He could feel the overwhelming energy that seeped out of the cracks in the walls and enriched the air he breathed. He wandered down the rickety stage steps and made his way over to the piano he so often played as a child. There was a thin layer of dust coating the piece that came away with a drag of his finger. As he sat down before the piano, the building seemed to swell with excitement. Eli pulled up the fallboard gently, tapping the top of the keys as not to make a sound. A memory of a young boy, his toes barely reaching the pedals and his arms not quite long enough to reach the end keys without leaning, fell into his mind. He smiled, a warm feeling in his chest as he remembered the peace he had felt sitting here as a child. He let the silence surround him, the only sound the distant mumble of the manager selling tickets on the phone in the lobby. He focused on the piano before him and followed his instinct to where he should place his hands. His body suddenly ran with goosebumps, and it felt as if he were being led. He let his hands take the lead, playing a delicate song he had never heard before, as was how he played as a child. The theater filled with the sound of beautiful music, and his body filled with energy. He smirked, letting out an excited breath that had caught itself in his throat. Closing his eyes, he leaned back his head as his fingers danced across the keys. He felt alive. Mason smiled down at Eli as he wrapped his arms around him, showing him the way to the correct keys. The music was beautiful and just the way it should be. He could feel the love resonating from Eli's soul, brightening the area with energy and passion. He had an inkling when he first saw him in the lobby, but now as they leaned over the instrument together, he knew that his lover had returned. As Eli leaned back into the music, his head fell to Mason's shoulder, and the ghost once again felt that warm feeling within his chest, as if he himself was alive again. Excuse me? The moment scratched to a halt as Eli jumped in fright, looking behind him to see the manager standing with her hands on her hips.
Hi. Sorry, I got lost in what I was doing.
Eli stood up bashfully and stepped around the bench to face the manager. You can't be in here alone. I've got to close soon and clean up so I can go home. He nodded and rushed over to the seat that his satchel hung on.
I'm so sorry. Do you need help cleaning up? I'd love to help out around here.
The manager looked at him with a questioning brow. You can check out our website and send us an email for volunteer work.
Okay, I'll check that out. Sorry again if my playing was bothering you.
She shrugged and waved him to follow her. It's alright, just next time, ask. I've witnessed some pretty spooky stuff in this theater and I thought you might have been one of the ghosts. Eli smiled at the thought.
Ghosts, huh? Never really believed in them.
Mason slammed the fallboard shut, startling the pair, who whipped around to look at the piano where the sound had come from. The manager chuckled. Careful what you say, you might upset them. Eli's eyes drifted from the piano reluctantly and back to the manager.
Perhaps.
The manager smiled a knowing smile and waved him on. Alright, well, why don't you get out of here so you can write up that email for me? Vaude stood beside the musician's piano. The dark filled them with an empty delight. The story had begun, and soon the actors would start piecing things together. No one knew what was to be lost but Vaude, and no one knew what was to be gained. When the time was right, Vaude would tell the lovers their prophecy, but until then they would enjoy the peace that came with being alone here. They were quite happy to be solace, as they often were. Vaude let the sound of past orchestras pulse through their veins, and the applause of the crowd pump their heart. The tension of what was to come was hanging in the catwalks, ready to come crashing down. Mason joined Vaude by the piano and took a seat, his fingers caressing the shadows of where Eli had placed his hands.
He has returned, hasn't he?
Vaude smiled, knowingly, before vanishing as a seething peacock came strutting down the aisle.
You need to control yourself. You're a fool.
Mason spun around, crossing his legs and leaning back on his elbow and back against the piano.
You're one to talk.
Beth narrowed her eyes and huffed.
If you don't stop immediately, I'll do something drastic.
Mason looked at her unimpressed.
What are you gonna do? Burn down the theater again? How'd it go for you last time?
The fan in her hand cracked under her balled fist.
You don't want to know what I will do. Just take the warning and stop fooling with the living.
She vanished immediately after, and left Mason to think of her words. He simply shoved her out of his mind and turned back to the piano, warmed by the thought of Eli. Tune in next week for the second chapter of L'Amour et l'Amour, where we learn more about the lover's prophecy and the truth behind Beth's jealousy. This has been the No Hetero Bro podcast, hosted by yours truly, H.J. Lee. Thank you for listening, and as always, hope your week is gay in all senses of the word.